serious survivors of plane crashes, boat sinks or something catastrophic of this magnitude. What's your story? So when I was a very young child, I lived in Southeast Asia. One day early in the morning I was just playing. My parents must have been doing their morning prayers and the next thing I knew the entirety of the ocean was spilling over itself. We lived on the coast at this time, and it was like the whole ocean had just lifted out. My dad grabbed me and ran towards a block of apartments at the end of the street. I don't know what happened to my mum, but she must have been unable to run fast enough, because I'm pretty sure she got overwhelmed by the tide and survived by holding onto a tree. I'm not entirely sure how she survived actually, because looking back on the extent of the 2004 tsunami she should have been swept away completely by the force of the water. So now I'm on the top of this roof and my dad goes back in, swimming to our house, to retrieve our passports and documents, while the water keeps creeping up. I think it was a 4 or 5 story building, and the water must have reached the 2nd or 3rd floor. He must have been a really strong swimmer, because he got pretty much all of our documents in between the waves, and probably saved my mum as well. After this we were able to stay with friends some distance away after this, but everything in the town got destroyed. In fact I realized the reason why my parents don't bring up my childhood friends, or try to keep in contact with their families, is because they are dead. This is pretty much the only really vivid memory I have from that age, and my parents still kind of had a fear of the sea for a long time after that. They still can't handle videos of flooding. Edit. My dad appreciates becoming a legend on Reddit. By the way, my mum is doing absolutely fine now. She's learning how to swim. Here's a question I can honestly answer. I survived an airplane crash. The story. My mother owned a few aircraft and hangar at our small town's airport. I spent a lot of time at the airport as I was growing up, spending summer washing airplanes, sweeping out hangars, etc. One warm summer afternoon in the mid-1980s we planned to take a short flight in her Piper J3 Cub. This plane was built in the mid-1940s and had an aluminum skeleton covered in fabric and tandem seats, one in front, one in back. I sat in front due to the better view and my mom, the pilot, sat in back. I remember the pre-flight and some taxiing to the runway, but nothing else. Now the rest of the story I received secondhand. Neither my mom nor I remember anything of the actual accident due to the massive head trauma we both received. But what I've heard from family and the ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene is that on takeoff, the most dangerous part of any flight, IMHO, we lost power. Engine cut out, not really sure why. So with a relatively slow airspeed and no thrust from the engine we changed from being a beautiful flying machine to a brick rather quickly. Well, we dropped like a brick and proceeded to hit the ground in a rather quick manner. The ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene thought we were done for. Things did not look good for us. But after a helicopter ride to the nearest trauma center 100 miles away, we are still alive and breathing today. I spent about 5 weeks in the hospital, but only remember the last 2. To remind me what happened, I have nasty scars on my lower lip and chin and a dent on the side of head. One thing I find myself wondering is if I had the chance to relive the whole thing over again, would I want to remember? At this point in my life I can say I would not. Such things are not worth remembering. And did we ever fly again? You bet. As soon as my mom was able to pass a flight physical we were both up in the air again. Fact, I'm late to the party point. I was pilot in command of a small Cessna, taking my dad out for his first sightseeing ride on an October evening. He'd taken the back seat in one of my training sessions before, but this time was the first time the two of us were alone together and at liberty to go as we pleased. After a while, I noticed that the engine had lost 300 RPM. I pushed the throttle to maximum, no change. Turned on the carb heat, if I remember correctly. Nope, still nothing. I began heading back to the airport, but as the power slowly diminished, I knew we wouldn't make it back by a long shot. Conclusion. I had to get that bad down somewhere. It was nighttime. Beneath me were patches of fields or forest, and I couldn't tell which was which in the evening darkness. I opted for the only well-lit place in the circumstances, the freeway. I made my emergency call, got a response, told my dad what I was about to do, and proceeded to fly the airplane. By the time I was on my so-called final approach, The engine was puttering along at a measly 1000 RPM despite a full open throttle. All I had to do was to follow a slight bend in the freeway to the left, just past a viaduct, and I'd have 3 open lanes of road on which to land, and probably surprise a few drivers along the way. Huge black bars suddenly showed up in my field of vision, followed by bright white flashes of light. The aircraft had just struck high voltage power lines by the time I was done screaming. The aircraft had rolled down in a side ditch and slammed itself against a fence. Ambulances arrived within a minute, pulled my dad and I out, and raced us to the hospital. I awoke in a dimly lit hospital room, dimly lit because of the city-wide power failure I'd just caused, which I realized once all the other lights turned on late at night and the nurses cheered at getting power back. Somehow, I didn't break anything, though I had a sore and stiff body for a few weeks, and my back became prone to locking for the next several years. My father had a few broken bones, but was judged stable and set to recover. However, he suddenly and unexpectedly succumbed to his wounds a week later. I haven't piloted an aircraft since, and have no desire to. I can be a passenger in an airliner or a commercial small aircraft without a problem, but my days of flying are over. I was in a plane crash in 2013, 3 friends, and I had taken a Cessna to Interior BC for the long weekend. One friend had their private pilot's license. The day we were heading home it was quite hot, and the plane was, according to investigators, overloaded and overfueled for the heat/altitude. Once we reached 2,000 feet above Kiev we began losing airspeed. The pilot panicked and did some steep turns in an attempt to gain some speed, but it scrubbed nearly all our altitude pretty much instantly. Now at a few hundred feet and descending rapidly, the pilot took aim at a farmer's field. They managed to level out at around tree height, but we were quickly running out of field. Maybe 100 or so meters before the end of the field they dropped the plane to the ground, the nose dug in, and we flipped end for end. I ended up walking away essentially unscathed, minor bruising from the seat belt and some small scratches. The pilot had a pretty good cut and bashed their knee up on the dashboard. The front passenger, my girlfriend, took pretty much the brunt of it all. Her seat ripped off the floor, smashing her against the roof. It shredded the ligaments in one side of her neck, compressed her spine, and concussed her badly. The ligaments were bad and are still causing issues now 5 years later. But the post-concussion issues were far worse. Watching someone you love lose the ability to read, remember what they had for breakfast, or whether or not they had breakfast, maintain any semblance of emotional stability, or even do something like play a board game to pass the time, learning and remembering rules was too stressful, was the worst thing I have ever experienced. It took a solid 2 years before things started returning to what I could call normal. I'm sure he'll come back and edit/add to this post, but I've got to get back to work. TLDR, here's a pic of the plane. I'm late, but I hope some people can hear me out. I was in a plane crash when I was 9. It was a small plane, with only my dad and I being the only ones in the plane. The plane had 4 doors and a propeller. That kind of plane. We were about 1,000 feet over the San Francisco Bay, and the engine quit. The plane proceeded to fall, as would be the case. We approached the water, my 9-year-old brain coming to grips with the concept of death and such. We hit the water, and the plane skipped a few times, and water began to flood through the floor. My dad and I got out, and sat on the wing of our sinking plane for about 30 minutes, and the plane was too sunk to stay sitting on, so we had no choice other than to swim towards shore. The shoreline was miles away at least, however we had no other options. As we were swimming, mind you the water was freezing in October, another recreational pilot in a helicopter flew overhead and attempted to drop us life jackets. One was horribly off the mark, but we were able to grab one. After swimming for half a mile in t-shirts and shorts we came across a mudflat and dragged ourselves onto it. We were waiting there for a while, and a Department of Fish and Game boat trolled by, looking for illegal hunters. This led to our rescue. When I got home, I took the best shower of my life. Now, I'm 19 and still have a residual fear of flying, but I'm okay with flying on my own and all that. What really left an impact on me is the experience of a worst case scenario, and how my mind will usually jump to that in most situations. This anxiety has led to me being incredibly jumpy and on edge constantly. PTSD can manifest itself in all walks of life, with even the littlest things resulting in my getting spooked. As a 9-year-old without any follow-up therapy, coming to terms with this on my own has really shaped my character. The cause of the crash? Condensation in the fuel bladders of the plane put water in the engine, killing it mid-flight. They didn't successfully recover the plane, but they managed to pull it up out of the water to see if they could determine a cause. The plane was far too damaged to be anything other than scrap at that point. On a positive note, this accident gave me a new perspective on life and showed me that life can be taken away just as easily as it is given. Life each day like it could be your last. Sorry in advance for bad English. Since I live in Chile, I'm used to earthquakes. Perhaps in some countries an earthquake of magnitude 6.0 in the Richter scale is something big, but here is kinda normal. But the one I will never forget is the 8.8 earthquake in the Richter scale that happened in Santiago of Chile. Let me explain a bit. I'm a native of the northern region of the country, where most of the earthquakes happen. So the constructions are especially resistant against earthquakes. Santiago is not like that, since they rarely got movement. So back to the story. I was going to a concert in Santiago and was staying in a friend's apartment for the week I was there. It was the 27th of February of 2010, 3:33 am. We were chilling with my friend and some of his when suddenly all the light went down. We thought that maybe the building got a malfunction. Then, looking through the large windows, we saw all the city went dark. I don't know if you guys have been on an apartment building during a huge earthquake, but summer rising is like being on top of a wet noodle that moves one side to another constantly. The first thing that got to my head is to stay away from the large windows and go under the table. I happen to be very cold-minded in this situation, by the way. While my friend and his were screaming like hell, I tried to keep them calm by telling them the usual, everything is going to be okay. Earthquakes are usually short, so we just needed to wait in safe. Jesus, I was wrong. The earthquake was 3 minutes long. The largest 3 faking minutes of my life. When it finished I was relieved. I checked if everyone were okay and they were just scared as fuck. I asked my friend, named Ben by the way, that we need to get the hell out of there. Ben gave me the reason and pack up a BP with some supplies. When he was getting his BP, his friends just run of the place to get to their families. Told them to stop, that we need to stay cool and together, but the need to see their families was greater. And I totally understand that. Ben finished packing, and we started running to the emergency stairs. We were making our way, while using the cell phones to illuminate the hallway, when suddenly Ben stopped me from nowhere. I asked him what wrong, and he just replied me look, pointing the flash of the phone to the floor. I was just like the movies. The building was split in half, a yellow HH sheet, when he falls on his knees, while looking at the bottom of the building. His friends, in the rush to see their families, didn't saw that the building was split in half and fell down. We expected the worst. Ben started crying, and I was in shock. Just 30 minutes back I was hanging out with them, laughing, and now I just see their bodies. Their point and infinity of screams and cries created the atmosphere of that night. We make our way down through the holes in the building. While doing it, we tried to help as many persons as we can, some trapped by giant stones, some just dead. The one image that will stick to me forever was the one of a mother hugging his daughter. In order to protect her, we find both of them dead. We got to the place where Ben's friends fall, and thanks to I don't know who, they were still alive, with many broken bones but alive. We took them one by one to the road and wait for help from police, military, medics or firemen, but lucky us, we were all alive. I watched and experienced two sides of humans that day, the ones that try everything to help other in any way possible, and on the other side, the ones that take advantage of the situation, just to steal stuff from destroyed homes. So that my story is actually way longer, but didn't want it to make it tedious to read. Thanks for reading a piece of my story. Edit. Wow, didn't expect this to blow up, haha. Thanks everyone for your kind words. We are actually fine now. For anyone curious, here is a pic of the building the next day. Random fact. 3 years later another 8,3 earthquake hit my city. Lucky me, how? When I was 19, my buddy and I went fishing. It's a pretty big lake up in Gainesville, Florida. I was sitting at the very front with the cooler to try to balance out the weight, and while we were crossing the middle of the lake in Arguino, we had a paddle strapped to the side, and it caught the water. While we were going about 20 miles per hour, it threw us probably 7 to 10 feet and immediately started sinking. About 5 minutes before that happened, we decided to put both of our phones in a waterproof box, which ultimately saved us because there was no one else out that day, given it was a little chilly outside. So after we were in the water, the boat started sinking fast, but my friend and I stayed calm and started brainstorming on what we should do. First thing I did was swim down to the boat and by feel had to find the phones. Once that happened, we called the police, but their response time was awful. We were treading in water that was cold enough to give us hypothermia, with the box that had our phones in it over our heads for about 50 minutes until the dispatch lady said they were commandeering someone else's boat because theirs wasn't starting. Once we got out, the officers told us that they were expecting to find us dead, either from getting stuck on the mushy bottom and drowning or by some of the big gators, but luckily we didn't encounter any of them. After the ambulance took our temperature and we came back fine, they proceeded to make sure we were okay, then let us get on with our day. Life and death situations are no joke and they can happen at any time. Make sure you are prepared mentally and physically. Your life or your friends may depend on you and how you've trained. When I was 9, we were traveling from our cabin back to town with a rope and boat. This was right before Easter. About a 45-minute trip. The seas were rough and the boat had a built-in flaw that caused it to break in 2 pieces due to the pounding on the waves. I sat faced towards the back, so I didn't see it break. Just suddenly had water up to my waist. When I turned around, the nose was floating a couple of meters away from the boat. My mom's husband at the time just said jump, and so we did, into the black 2-degree water of the North Sea, as far away from the boat as possible. This was by far the scariest moment. Her husband managed to launch 2 emergency rockets before the boat vanished below him. He was a very poor swimmer, and even though we tried to hold on to him, he got away from us due to large waves constantly covering us. After that, it was about 10 minutes of trying to swim to shore, which was about 400 meters away, before realizing we were never going to make it. After that, we basically dodged waves and made bad taste jokes. We saw people on the shore. Cars stopped on the highway. The last thing I remember before blacking out is a boat approaching. Then I woke up in the hospital, basically trashing around from the cramps of my body trying to warm up. Apparently I had a temp of 27 degrees when they brought me in. My mom was awake the whole time. She lost control of her limbs right after I blacked out and gripped a rope from my life vest with her teeth so I wouldn't float away. Even though this is a scary story, there are some awesome element to it. An old fisherman in a house by the shore saw the whole thing. He was desperately trying to get a hold of rescue services, but noon was where they were supposed to be. His wife, having lost both her previous husband and also a son at sea, had some kind of a health issue while watching us swim around. So he had to take care of her and try to get us help. The most baddest part of the story is how we got rescued. One of my mom's husband's friends got a call about what was happening, got in his boat with his 8-month pregnant wife, and went full speed to our location. The boat he had was not designed for high seas. It was a summer-type cabin cruiser, so he had to steer it towards the waves at all times. His wife then proceeded to pull 3 fully clothed people up to safety, including an unconscious me. If anyone has ever tried to pull someone out of the water, you know how difficult it is. We all survived. I was totally fine, aside from my balls swelling up to 3 times the normal size for a couple of days. Mom tore a bunch of stuff in her back. Husband swallowed about 4 liters of salt water and was sick for a week. TLDR, boat broke I2, cold water, amazing rescue. The following morning we set off on the final leg of the journey really early the next day. Everyone was feeling pretty terrible after drinking way too much, so we're trying to catch a few hours nap on the boat. Around an hour or 2 into the journey, the boat rolled quite heavily to one side and some cups and glasses slid off the tables and fell onto the floor, startling most people awake. We picked the stuff up off the floor and went back to sleep. I'm not really sure how much later, but the same thing happened again, but even more violently. The boat rolled so heavily I slid from one side to the other and smashed into a table on the now lower side of the boat. At this point I noticed that water had started to come over the side and was getting deeper. Everyone was looking around at each other looking pretty terrified, not knowing what to do. The water level was now at probably waist height. I told my girlfriend to get out of the boat and swim for the banks of the river. I had to help her climb out the high side of the boat and onto the roof as the lower side was now pretty much fully submerged. At this point I realized I was stuck between the table I had smashed into and a bench that had fallen on top of my leg, with the water now getting towards shoulder height and the boat sinking pretty rapidly. I took a final breath and went down with the boat. It's hard to say how long, but it probably sank in around a minute, 2 if you were being generous. Luckily, as the boat fully sank, the benches and tables started to float and move away from each other, and I got free without too much trouble. I opened my eyes and all I could see was brown dirty water with some sunlight in the distance. I swam towards it, being careful not to knock my head on anything and knock myself out, trying to swim horizontal until I was sure I was clear from the boat before I could try for the surface. I managed to pop up not too far away from the riverbank. I looked around and saw a few of the other passengers being swirled around in the rough current, trying to grab anything that was floating to save themselves, calling out for help. I'm a pretty terrible swimmer, so realized trying to help anyone else would probably just end in them dragging me down with them, so struggled and eventually made it to the bank. I made it, but didn't have the energy to pull myself out of the water. I half got onto some rocks and waited to catch my breath. Some other passengers that made it out of the water ran over to tell me my girlfriend was safe further downstream. The guy driving the boat had jumped in and pulled her out because she was struggling. To give some background detail, this boat was being run by a young family that lived on board. As it customary in large parts of Asia, it is considered rude to wear your shoes inside someone's house. As a consequence, we had to remove our shoes when boarding the boat. We were now trying to traverse the rocky banks of the river with no shoes, trying to find other passengers. Getting back to the main story, the captain of the boat at this stage was screaming at the river, not knowing if his wife and 2 children made it off the boat before it sank. We came across them later on. His wife had somehow managed to make it off with her baby slung over her back and her young son. After a while we had managed to flag down another passing boat. Initially they didn't stop, but I think they must have started to see random bits of floating debris from the boat and realized what had happened and came back for us. Further down the river we found more passengers that had been rescued by some local fishermen. We tried to account for everyone and quickly worked out that everyone was present apart from one girl. No one had seen her during the scramble to get off the boat. We boarded the boat that we managed to flag down and left for the next nearest large town where we would be able to get in contact with our country's embassies. There was zero phone signal around here and all our phones were either in the river or completely soaked, which was over 6 hours away. The local fishermen promised us they would search for the missing passenger. Having made it to the next town after a pretty faking long day, by this point we were greeted by the local police who were in plain clothes as it was Songkran and everyone was celebrating by having a huge 3-day water fight. They took some details and told us to come to the station in a few days. We ended up having to sit around for days sorting out loads of stuff as our passports were lost and all the local places that could do anything were closed. Once we got enough documents to allow us to move on and fly to the capital, we had to go to our consulate to sort out new travel documents and assist in the matter about the missing passenger with her friends that had made it off the boat. She was from the same country. After a few days the consulate informed us a body had been found, and unfortunately it was the missing passenger, which was pretty devastating experience to take along with the additional stress everyone was currently going through. I feel like I'm rambling on now, but after a few weeks we luckily managed to get new passports without flying home, which we were informed is the standard procedure for my country's passport office. Going home to get a full passport wasn't really an option as we were around 5 weeks into a 7-month trip. Was a pretty fun 6 months after that, although did end up in some other pretty dangerous situations. We were also on 2 buses that crashed, and a friend of mine that came and met us for a month was involved in a pretty nasty motorbike accident. Apologies for the piss poor comprehension. I've never taken the time to write this experience down before, and I'm not the best writer as it is TLDR. Got on a boat. It sank. It wasn't much fun. I was in a smallish fishing boat charter that sank a little less than 12 miles from a Caribbean island in the Atlantic. From the first sign of trouble to looking straight down at the boat slowly sinking beneath the surface was only about 10 minutes time. Trust me when I say that's an image I'll never forget. A white sport fisher being swallowed by the dark blue beneath me. When boats sink, they sink. Somewhere in the chaos the captain called his friends in the marina before the boat sank, so we waited there just drifting for a while, collecting any floating debris we could hang on to. Fortunately we had life vests, otherwise I have no doubt we'd all be dead. 2 hours pass. Nobody comes by to pick us up. Clouds and rain are more frequent, so we lose sight of the island occasionally, and I finally convince everyone to agree to start swimming towards the island. I know the best thing to do is stay together and not move, but the island didn't seem too far away, and it was obvious to me that nobody was going to find us at this point. Just as we start slowly moving, a helicopter comes and hovers somewhere between us and the island, presumably over the coordinates the captain gave his friends. I swim my ass off towards that thing, and in so doing, lose sight of the captain and first mate, so now it's just me and my sister, and then the helicopter leaves. That sucked. But, given the weather, there was almost zero chance of them spotting us, unless we were right under them. We decide our best chance at survival is to keep swimming towards the island. The whole time it's rainy, cloudy, rough seas. There was a small craft advisory. Wish we had been told that before leaving the marina, and much of the time, literally hours, we can't see the island at all and use the wind as a directional guide. That sensation of not being able to see anything but grey skies and waves with nothing to grasp onto was the toughest part. We did see another helicopter before nightfall, when the weather started clearing a bit, but it was way too far away from us. Nightfall is also when we can tell that we actually made progress and were getting closer to the island, but the darkness changes all that, as all we could look at were a handful of lights on the island and a bright spot that was probably a resort 7 or so miles to the north. Fast forward to maybe 2 or 3 AM, some 15 to 16 hours after the boat sank, and we actually get to the island. Of course it's mostly cliffs, the water is colder, being churned from the deep by the currents hitting the island, so we swim south until we can see water that isn't white. We get out of the water maybe an hour later and can barely walk. There are some lights in the distance, but no way we were gonna get to them in our condition, so we just tried to stay warm under some trees out of the rain. No sleep, just shivering and trying to stay warm. Finally the sun comes up, and we are able to stop shivering. We can walk somewhat better now, so we start drinking from a nearby stream, assuming we'll get to help before we die from some parasite, and start hiking over the hills. I tossed my life vest into a tree just in case someone spots it. The hike takes us a few hours over 2 ridges, and through some pretty thick brush. Fortunately there were a few more streams. We finally get to a makeshift farm of sorts, and decide to eat some bananas from a small banana grove. That's when we spot a guy walking to work on the farm. He feeds us some crackers and water and walks up the road to call the police for us. Based on where we got to land, they changed their search and found the captain and first mate in the water shortly thereafter. We all end up in the hospital around the same time, and we finally got to escape the hospital after 36 hours and several bags of fourth fluids. There's a lot more that happened in that whole 72-hour period, but you get the idea. Funny thing, we went back about 8 months later and tried to get a boat to take us to where we got to land, but they all said it was too dangerous. It was all over the news for like 2.6 minutes, like everything these days. Even though we all survived, I still have PTSD from that event, which sucks. It's pretty well triggered when I'm on the water and it's stormy, or in airplanes and it's turbulent, and I fly all the time. Sigh, but PTSD be damned. I'm planning on buying a sailboat by the end of the year and sailing around the Caribbean and Central America, and if I can get enough blue water experience across the Pacific, we'll see. My plane landed in a field and flipped flying in a single-engine Cessna 210. My family was on the final leg of a 2-week camping trip. My dad Piloting had started the descent down when at 3,000 feet, our engine started rattling uncontrollably. 10-year-old me remembers seeing the oil temperature gauge in the red, but not understanding the significance. As the rattling got worse, my dad shut the engine off and radioed Mayday to the tower. That's when I started to pray. We were only 5-ish miles from our final destination, but we had to make an emergency landing in a field point. I remember staring out the window at the ground thinking about my cat, and my mom leaning back from the co-pilot seat to tell my brother and I to pull our legs up for the crash position. My dad exchanged a few other words with the controller and then shut the rest of the plane down. We hit the ground a little fast at 80 knots. Normal is 65 to 70 kts. Our front gear struck an irrigation pipe running across the field, which caused it to shear off. Without a front gear, our nose hit the field and we went belly side up point. When I came to, everything was eerily dark, and I was hanging upside down. My dad basically ripped the doors off the back of the plane to get my brother and I out. My family was shaken up, but okay. The farmer appeared minutes later, absolutely astonished. Then, 5 news helicopters starting circling. Traffic was backed up 4 miles around the field as people strained to get a look. Then the paramedics arrived. My mom likes to joke they were a bit disappointed to find victims of a plane crash to be standing around chatting. The worst injury of the lot was my cut lip, which I cut with my own teeth in the jolt of the crash. And my parents got some bruising from seat belts a few days later. The farmer's wife gave my brother and I Cheez-Its and honey sticks, and I can't eat them to this day. And the first thing I did when I got back home was hug my cat. As a 10-year-old does as far as my individual story goes. I got my pilot's license 3 years ago at the age of 18. I'm now in school to become an aerospace engineer, where I hope to one day design planes that save people like this one saved my life. It failed in the most elegant of ways, and my dad's quick thinking and training was able to see us to the ground alive point. And for those wondering what happened to the plane, an unidentified object clogged the oil filter in the engine, leading to a piston overheating, snapping, and punching a hole in the side of the engine. I was stuck in a bushfire here in Australia. Myself and our infant son were in the car evacuating on the only road out of our small town. We got very little warning as the fire moved so fast. Fire was coming on the right side of the road. Smoke everywhere, could hardly see. So was driving, and luckily saw the truck in front of us, and stopped in time before hitting it. A semi-trailer truck, 18-wheeler, had jackknifed in the road, and was blocking the way. We couldn't see if anyone was in the truck, and I was going to go out and check, but the fire was now at the roadside on our right, and years of fire safety education had taught me, you stay in the car. We had a UHF radio in the car, so tried to contact the truck on that with no response. The fire started to blow across the road and ignite the bush on our left. There were embers raining down on our car. We just stared at them bouncing off the car bonnet. I saw a flashing red glow in the smoke beyond the truck, and it took a minute or so to work out what I was seeing. It was a fire service truck. I had to fight every bit of instinct I had in me, which was screaming at me to grab my baby, hide him inside my clothes, and run towards the red lights. I doubt I'd have made it. Fire was literally blowing around in front of us, but damn if that wasn't the strongest instinct I've ever felt. I just sat there in the car repeating over and over to myself, stay in the car. Stay in the car. So managed to contact the Ferries on the UHF to alert them to our presence. They sprayed water over us, while a secondary truck drove through the burning scrub around the big truck to reach us, and then the rest all was a blur, being transferred to their truck, and driving out of there watching the bushfire raging behind us. Saw the news in hospital where they reported 2 deceased people found in that semi-trailer truck. Volunteer firefighters saved our lives. I'm probably too late to the party, but I was stuck on an island in the middle of a huge lake when a hurricane hit. I've never told this story in writing, but here it goes. This was near St. Petersburg, Russia, in the summer of around 2010. My family went on a week-long kayaking trip. We had cell phone reception and kept in touch with the outside world, but there was no hurricane warning whatsoever. It was an abnormally hot summer, which in retrospect is probably what caused a hurricane, but at the time we had no idea anything was coming. The sky was absolutely clear, there was no wind, and the water was extremely still. That day, we stopped at a small rock island about 15 feet above water level and 60 feet across with a few small trees on it. That evening, had a nice fireplace going, cooked dinner, and were having tea, when I noticed a heavy rain cloud on the horizon. Oops, looks like we need to cover our tents, and put all our stuff inside. Not a big deal. After about 15 minutes, we were prepared for the rain. By that time, the heavy rain cloud moved significantly closer to us, and looked quite formidable. I remember standing at the edge of our island, overlooking the lake, finishing up my tea, when the cloud reached a neighboring island. There was another camp there, and I saw their campfire go out in a second. I yelled for everyone to get in their tents, and ran to my tent. At this point, we were still just expecting a heavy rain. As I got into my tent, I barely had enough time to zip it closed when the first gust hit. It immediately tore the tent cover right off. The top of our tent was mesh and see-through. I looked up and saw the tent cover, which was still tied to a tree by 2 ropes, waving like a 10-foot flag. Our tent almost collapsed as well from the wind. Somehow I remembered my alpine training and grabbed the inner poles of the tent to prevent their collapse. This probably did more harm than good in retrospect, but I couldn't really think fast at the time. This was very sudden and very destructive. As I was holding the tent, the rain flooded through the mesh ceiling onto my back. I turned from very warm to shivering cold in a matter of seconds. I was in a tent with my younger cousin, and he just remembers being in shock and me stretched on top of him trying to hold the tent together. My mom with her friend was in a different tent several feet away, but I could not see it due to the intensity of the rain. I don't talk to God often, but as I was holding that tent like my life depended on it, I remember repeating over and over a phrase, asking my mom to be okay. After several minutes of this, the tent door opened, and my mom crawled in. Apparently, she thought she heard me calling out her name and heroically crawled across to our tent. Her part of the story is fascinating as well, but let's leave it for a different time. The highlight is that she saw waves several meters high and an inflatable fishing boat was flying above the neighboring island. Several minutes later, the wind subsided a little and her friend made it over to our tent as well. Their tent was completely destroyed and ripped to shreds. We spent some time trying to get gallons and gallons of water out of our tent, until eventually, we were too exhausted, so we all fell asleep and whatever clothes were hidden in hermetic bags and remained dry. In the morning, we were awoken by rescuers, who greeted us from their boat with anyone alive left on the island. After we confirmed that all of us were alive, they just left us there. Luckily our kayaks were tied well, so we could get out of there safely. The aftermath. Tall trees in the mainland were mowed down like grass. Some of our stuff flew away. We were able to miraculously find some of it the next day. Around 160 people died that night on the lake. There was no official mention of this anywhere, but the locals still talk about overfilled morgues in the region. I'll try to find some pictures of the aftermath, if there is any interest in the story. Here is an album with some descriptions. Sorry for the potato quality. Edit. As people have correctly pointed out, hurricane is not the right word to use in this context. It's more of a hurricane-like storm. We don't have a special name for this in Russia, because this never happens in the region. Here is a Wikipedia page. Speedboat capsized in the Mexican Ocean. In August 2012, 5 friends and I rented a penthouse and stayed in San Jose del Cabo for a month. On our second day there, we rented a speedboat, came with a driver, for our much anticipated wakeboarding excursion. The majority of the ride was fantastic, dolphins, etc. We had a blast. We followed the shoreline from San Jose del Cabo to Cabo San Lucas. Midpoint in our trip, we went to flip a U in a harbor close to the Holiday Inn. Then, all hell broke loose. At the apex of our turn, we lost power. This means, the front of our boat was facing the beach, the back was facing the ocean. Now, if you're not familiar with the Mexican undercurrent, it's fast and the water deepens very quickly. The tide pulled us into the waves. With every surge, the water pushed the tail of the boat, where I was sitting, up, while tilting the nose down. As soon as I noticed that tilt, I knew impending doom was coming. Surely enough, the next push of the water tilted the nose far enough down to be caught by the undercurrent, thus throwing me straight up in the air. At this point, the boat hadn't flipped yet. When the receding wave brought the boat back level, gravity returned me to my seat on the boat. I landed on my feet, but felt a shock up my back and an immediate, smashing warmth in my spine. Then bam. I fell forward in between the seats, and couldn't feel a faking thing below my chest. Meanwhile, the boat is on the verge of being flipped vertically. My friend Catty jumps on top of me and holds onto the railing with all of her strength, so I don't fly off or get dragged away. Another wave pounds. This time water slams into the boat, smacking Catty in the back. The force of the water pounds her nose right into the back of my head, breaking her nose. When this happened, I think I blacked out for a second. I'm a very strong swimmer, so when I finally felt the boat getting sucked out from under us, I remember thinking I have to swim as hard as I can, or I'm going to die. So I did. A local surfer, Juan, hope to thank this guy again someday, saw it all happen and swam out with his board, and helped me to shore. There is a video out there taken by someone on that beach, but I've never been able to find it. My friend lost her wallet. I lost my re-entry visa. A scumbag dude later tried to hustle me for $50 a new one for our return flight. I lost my favorite dress in that damned accident too. Some beach. I spent the rest of the month and my budget for what would have been fishing, golfing, drinking, stuff, with my friends, on food, tequila, hour-long massages, and Mexican OTC pain pills. The doctors there were fantastic. I had a T5-7 compression injury with bruising in my lumbar. He said I was extremely close to a serious injury. I still feel it 5 years later. I have PTSD from the accident, for sure. Boats make my sweaty. Back in 2008, I was in a hiking/sightseeing tour with a well-known rugged travel outfitter. The tour started in New Delhi, India and ended in Kathmandu, Nepal. Halfway through the tour, we meander our way to Varanasi when there were rumors of strikes in Nepal, mainly Lumbini and the Chitwan National Park area. So instead of taking a bus to the border, to get to the park in Nepal, we took a plane. Crisis averted, right? Landed in Kathmandu, and of course the baggage handlers decided to strike. Had to wait about 5 hours to get our bags. We stayed about a day at Kathmandu, and about the strike ended. We ended up proceeding with our trip to the Chitwan National Park and staying at a homestay for a few days. After a few days of getting our fill of elephant riding, hippo watching and tiger tracking, there were rumors going around in the village about a huge strike next day with travel on the roads potentially barred with the threat of death. We all decided to head out extremely early so we would not be stuck in Chitwan for potentially days. So around 3 AM, me and 11 other members of the group and our guide and driver head out into the dark and on to Kathmandu. It was quiet for about the 15 to 20 minutes of driving in the dark, lots of meandering turns around small villages and lakes. However, that was stopped short. We saw a small minibus torched, fires burning wildly, and soon we were stopped by these masked villagers holding sticks. One of them came to the driver's side and pulled the driver out. Proceeded to repeatedly smack him on his face over and over. Another masked man tried to open our passenger door. Luckily it could only be opened by one side, and luckily it was held tightly closed by a burly Australian member of our group. While this was going on, another masked man broke our back window. This resulted in a few of us crying in fear. Me, my cousin and a few other guys were thinking of breaking out of the car and tackling these masked men with skirts, long guys. We figured the combined arms of a few Americans, Aussies and a German can take them down right. No sooner than we thought of that plan, motorcycles started roaring in close by, carrying Molotov cocktails. Shit. Our guide and the driver started pleading with them, saying we are tourists, there are women in here, and that we will go back in peace. Just let us go. They eventually let us go, told us to turn around, and don't come out until the strike is over. To this day, every time I hear glass break, I cringe and remember these events clearly. Got caught in a wildfire in Chile early this year. Pretty much half the country was burning. We were taking a few days with my family, but the wildfires in the nearby towns, rain dashes all over the region. You could barely breathe. We stayed nonetheless, and went to a nearby town, Santa Olga, because we heard in the news that the fires were too close to the town and threatened to destroy the entire town, and we went there to help with supplies. Then we decided to help with the wildfires. In a very primitive way. Very few firefighters were around because the whole faking country needed help and people were afraid of losing their houses. Honestly, looking at their faces, I could not just go back home, and that's why we decided to help. When we were trying to put off the fire, a random burst of fire went all around us and surrounded my family and like 10 more people. Immediately, it was unreal. Didn't know fire could spread that quickly. We had no way out, and the fires were slowly going towards us, and we were trapped. We got really nervous, and it was pretty scary, since our proximity to the fire was suffocating us. It was pretty damn hot. If you ask me, I thought that was it, and I actually thought of suiciding somehow, because I can't even take it when I burn myself with a cigarette. Being burned down was probably the most painful way to die, but I never had the courage to do anything but to stare at the faking fires. We could not run over it, since the fire was super deep. Suddenly we heard a few planes and they dropped a shit ton of water that gave us a miraculous path to get the fuck out of there. There was still a lot of fire around, but it was thin enough for us to run over it. Also, the water hit us hard. It was a fuck ton of water, but hey, they saved my life and many others. We immediately got into our car and got the fuck out of there. We wanted nothing to do with it, as selfish as it sounds. We were shocked and said, fuck helping, we're out. We are totally done helping here. That town, Santa Olga, was actually 100% consumed by the fires. An entire town turned into ashes. I survived a nearly F5 tornado. A few years ago, living in rural Arkansas, the weather got bad. This is hardly an uncommon occurrence. My now fiance and I had just gotten a puppy that very day, and we also had 2 cats at home. We lived in a duplex. Around 7:30ish, our phones started alerting to severe weather, and we switched on the TV to watch the radar. Tornado heading our way. I threw my cats in the bathroom while my partner went outside to watch the weather. It was pouring rain. Never heard such heavy rain before. And then, the rain stopped. He rushed in, threw everything out of the innermost closet, and we hunkered in there with the puppy. He texted his parents, tornado. And we waited. They say it sounds like a freight train, and they are right. The building was shaking, and there was this roar. I was terrified. Holding the puppy and my phone with one arm/hand, holding my partner's hand with the other, just waiting for the building to collapse on me. He said he was quite certain we were about to die. And then, it stopped. We came out of the closet and out of the house to look around, dazed, just like the neighbors. I called my parents a few towns over. They owned the property, so I was telling them what was damaged. Our duplex was fine, some minor stuff only. A tree had fallen within inches of both another duplex and a neighbor's vehicle. Another tree had fallen on a third duplex. That one was totaled by the insurance company. It's an empty slab now. But no one in our immediate neighborhood was killed or injured. A lady in the destroyed one had been luckily sheltering in her bathroom as the tree came down right over her bed. We were all unhurt, but it was the most terrifying experience of my life because the tornado, which did cause several deaths elsewhere, had literally jumped over our little neighborhood. Had it stayed on the ground, we'd surely be dead now. In 2004, I was caught up in the Boscastle floods in Cornwall. I was 14 at the time and was on holiday with my mum, dad and younger brother. We'd arrived in the picturesque village of Boscastle to do the typical tourist things and parked in the car park, which was right next to the river. I remember standing looking at the river when we got out of the car. Others would too. It was really going some, but nobody thought anything of it. After a few minutes, we headed further down the river towards the Witches Museum, which was quite the attraction for the sleepy village. I can't remember much of the museum, but I'm sure it was excellent. We were near the end when the owner ran round saying we had to leave immediately as the river had burst its banks. We left, but at 14 years old, I was rather annoyed we hadn't got to the end. Obviously that was where the really good bits were. Unfortunately, by this point, the route back to the car park was blocked by a torrent of water. Fortunately, there was a high pass that we could walk along to snake up and around the village and get back to the car. It was however a long walk, run, Back, and by the time we reached the car park, it was knee deep in water. My dad took his shoes off and rolled up his jeans and went to fetch the car. At this point, cars were still getting out. I can remember the shop on the corner seemed to be getting looted, or maybe they were just giving away stock that they knew was going to waste anyway. We stood for a while, waiting for my dad to pull the car around, but the water kept getting higher. It wasn't just the depth of the water though that stands out. Water is powerful. A couple of young ladies had the same idea of rescuing their car and got stuck. They found refuge on a glass recycling bin. The moment scary kicked in was when the water started to move the bin. This was an industrial-sized bin, seemingly filled with glass. The water just picked it up and started to move it. At that point, people started to panic and realized this wasn't just a bit of water you could wade through. A couple of locals in wetsuits went in and managed to get the ladies on the bin to safety. At the same time, my dad returned without the car. As a family, we made our way up to higher ground to a nearby pub and had a cup of tea. Being English, this of course makes everything better. And it did, until I noticed through the window our red Ford Mondeo bobbing along the water in the distance. I went to ask my dad, who was sat next to me facing the window, "Is that our car?" But he cut me off, saying yes, it is the time to leave and move to higher ground. He'd seen our car too, but didn't want to panic my mum. We went to leave the pub, and the water had risen considerably higher. In the pub, we hadn't noticed it, but upon us leaving and commenting on it, everyone else left too. We all walked up the road and were taken in by a local couple who seemed to have an endless supply of bottled water. I'm not sure why they did or why I remember that, but I'm very grateful for their disaster planning. We stayed for a few hours before being collected by a minibus that took us to a local sports hall where the Red Cross had set up a disaster shelter. We spent the night there, though none of us, except my younger brother, slept. In the morning, the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, John Prescott, arrived. He made his way round the sports hall talking to each family in person one by one. He reached us, and me and my younger brother stood up. Mr. Prescott reached out and shook my dad's hand and simply asked, "So what's your problem?" I'm amazed that nobody died that day. The rescue effort was incredible and the help and support of the local community certainly played an integral part. For reference, my parents' insurance paid out fully on the car, no questions asked, and provided a hire car the very next day for the rest of our holiday. I've posted this before, but this is my plane crash story. The plane crash one happened when I was 6. My father had relatively recently gotten his pilot license to fly single-engine planes. We were flying with a couple of my parents' friends, my parents, me, the other couple, 5 in a 4-seater plane, from our home to a university, Purdue, a few states away for my parents' homecoming weekend. As we were flying, we were making good time and apparently not using too much fuel. At some point my father passed an airport, but decided not to refuel, since we should have enough to make it to Indiana. At some point after that, the headwind picked up, and we began to burn more fuel. The fuel was getting lower and lower as we neared our destination, though finally gave out some miles from the airport we were headed to. Even though I was 6, I remember it very clearly when the engine cut out. Little 4-seater planes were pretty loud and it can be hard to talk to each other in them. When the engine cut out, it got very quiet, and you could just hear the wind going by outside. It was night and my parents were trying to remain very calm, partially for my sake, but I remember my father saying "Mayday" on the radio as he relayed our situation. We could see the airport lights in the distance, but we were dropping in altitude as we silently glided down. Mostly there were trees below us, though it was hard to see, because it was totally dark out. Ahead, there seemed to be a big dark area that didn't seem to have trees in it, a hill up to the runway, and then the runway. It became clear that we were not going to make the runway as we got closer. We did clear the trees, luckily, because that would almost certainly have ended badly, but crash landed in the dark area before the hill. Though again, the side of the hill would have been a bad thing to land into. As it turned out, the dark area was a reservoir that had been recently drained after being full for 20+ years. I don't know what a water landing would have been like, but I don't imagine they are great for you. Instead of water was about 2 feet of mud and the plane kind of stuck into it when we hit. The landing gear was torn off, and the plane ended up nose forward in the mud. Surprisingly, the only injuries were a broken pinky on my dad's friend and my mom broke her nose on my back when we hit. I was sitting in her lap, since there were 5 of us in a 4-seater plane. Since my father had already alerted emergency services on the radio, the fire department and ambulances were already there. They threw a rope down the hill and waded through the muck to come get us. They then put us in an ambulance and took us to the hospital. I ended up spending the night so they could make sure that my back didn't get injured in the crash. But I was fine, though I remember being kind of freaked out when I woke up in the morning and my parents weren't back to the hospital yet, having spent the night at a hotel. In general, it turned out just to be a cool story, though my father never really liked to talk about it much. When I asked my mom why that was, she noted that he was a little sensitive about it, as it reminded him of the time that he almost killed his entire family. In fairness though, the situation of almost coming and clipped on the rope in the cave was actually a much closer scrape with death, and he was part of that one as well. Probably a bit too late to the party, but when I was 10 my house kinda blew up. When I was 10 years old, less than 10 days before Christmas time, there was a gas leak at my house. We had no idea it was leaking, but it had been building up behind our wall near the gas fireplace for a while. In the morning I was getting ready to go to school. My mom was almost ready to go to work, and I was tying my shoes to head out the door. My mom comes out of the bathroom and is putting on her earrings, grabbing her cell phone, and is heading toward the door. She tells me to unplug the Christmas tree lights. We love decorating. When I did, the spark from unplugging them ignited the box around the socket and then the pocket of gas behind the wall. It all blew up. The fireplace was pushed out of the wall in one whole piece. The wall was destroyed. The mantle over the fireplace flew clear across the room. The nutcrackers we left on the fireplace flew across the room and 2 got embedded in the wall. The Christmas tree, luckily a fake plastic one, was knocked over. The side facing the wall was curled, melted, and burned. Almost every ornament made of breakable stuff was shattered, rather from the boom or the fall, hard to tell. The shockwave traveled through the house, down the hallway into my mum's room, and blew out the sliding glass door, and blew it into the pool in pieces the size of pennies or smaller. All throughout the house were stress cracks in the sheetrock, cracks in windows, various things. We were lucky. I got minor burns on my face. I was just off to the side of said blown up wall. My mom was sitting on a chair near the door, far away from it all. Had she sat on the couch to put on her shoes, as she does sometimes, she may have been severely injured or worse. There was no real fire. It was more of a blast of really hot air, really fast. The fireman chief called it a flash fire. There was no fire, because there was nothing close enough to the hottest part that could ignite. Good thing we got a fake reusable tree that year to save money. If we had not, it definitely would have blown up. My story may not be what you're looking for, but it's recent. 2 months ago my wife, daughter, our 2 dogs, and I were rescued by boat from our neighbor's house. Let me say my house had never flooded before, and we aren't in any kind of floodplain. My flood insurance only costs a few hundred a year. We were at home during Hurricane Harvey. The storm hit, and we weren't expecting the water to get so high. We'd weathered hurricanes before in that house with no issues. After the first day we had water in the yard almost to our garage. By the next morning it was back in the street, but too high to drive out through. By noon the water had climbed midway up the yard. A friend and neighbor down 3 Street invited us to their house. Their house is on about 1 foot higher lot than ours. After being there about an hour, the San Antonio Fire Department knocked on the door to tell us that the next boat was the last one out. We were taken about a quarter of a mile away to the local elementary school. We were then moved by truck to a shelter set up at the local high school. Shelters are much worse than they look on TV. We spent the night on the tile floor in the hallway with bright fluorescent lights on the whole night. We only had blankets for bedding. All of our clothes were soaked. Friends, family, coworkers, members of my daughter's high school band and their parents helped us cut out drywall, remove contaminated furniture and flooring. During this process my wife stepped off a curb wrong and broke her foot. We did most of the demolition ourselves with their help. One of my dogs got ill from some bacteria in the water and required medical attention. 2 months later we are still trying to get our house rebuilt and trying to get the insurance company to pay for it. The contractor says they'll start Monday. We lost a car, most of our furniture and appliances, and we are living with family who've placed the house we are staying in on the market for sale. We'll eventually be okay, but it's at least 6 weeks out. I don't know if the story qualifies, but there it is. I survived a boat sinking. Me, my brother, my dad and his friend went sailing one day. The plan was to sail a few miles out round an old oil platform and back. My dad's friend was at the helm and was pretty inexperienced. Me and my dad were down below making tea because you know, we are British. When all of a sudden whack, there was this horrible bang and scraping sound. We had hit an illegal lobster pot and its anchoring line had wrapped around both our rudder and propeller, not spinning at the time. We were stuck, with no steering, and full sails up. We had to quickly lower the sails as we were being practically capsized by the wind blowing the sails. The stern of the boat was being dragged under, and we were slowly taking on water. Of course we put out a mayday call straight away, and all we could do was wait to be rescued. As we were waiting, the tide was coming in, and we were slowing, being dragged under. There was fuck all we could do but prepare for the worst. The lifeboat arrived as most of the stern was underwater, and they boarded our boat with an awesome looking scythe thing to attempt to cut the line that was wrapped around our boat. Unfortunately they couldn't free us, and by this point water was almost flowing into the cabin down below, so they evacuated us onto the lifeboat. We never saw that yacht again. It wasn't all that dramatic, to be honest. We kept our cool, and I'm actually fully trained in large-scale fire, evacuation, man overboard and first aid procedures for large commercial ships, so it was just a real-life drill for me. I actually filmed the whole experience on my dad's camcorder. The RNLI are real heroes. I seriously look up to those guys, and wish they got paid a whole lot more than they do. Most are actually volunteers. I remember one of the lifeboatmen was pretty pissed because he had been out having dinner with his wife for their anniversary, and he really didn't appreciate me putting a camera in his face. Edit, grammar, spelling, and I'm a spastic. In March of 2014, my girlfriend and I were in a single-engine plane crash in the Sierra Nevada mountains which we chartered for her birthday. When the fire chief arrived on the scene, he immediately walked up to the pilot, shook his hand and said, "In 30 years, this is the first time I've shaken the hand of the pilot after a single-engine plane crash on these mountains." It really put what happened that day into perspective. Both of us passengers and the pilot walked away with relatively no injuries. Small cut on the pilot's forearm, stiff necks. I'm happy to relay more details about why we crashed, what was said during / after the crash, what happened immediately after, reception from family / friends / media, what's happened since then, the missed signals / precautions that should have been taken, etc. Edit. Following requests. Here's the rest of the story. I had known the pilot through my employment as a recreation coordinator for a seniors department of a Parks and Recreation department. We'd established a relationship over the 2 years I worked there, and I came to learn about his history of flying planes during Vietnam, piloting Grand Canyon tours for plus 10 years, and flying recreationally / as a hobbyist in the Lake Tahoe area for the past 25 years. It came up in conversation that my girlfriend's birthday was a month away and that he'd be happy to take us on an aerial tour of Lake Tahoe. As we were freshly out of college and didn't have the financial means to do this on our own, we were happy to take the offer. Jump to the evening before of the accident. It had been very windy for the past several days and would be the follow day of which we were supposed to fly. I call our pilot and he says there is nothing to worry about. Trusting his decades of experience, I say, "Okay, we'll see you at the airport in the morning." Skipping past the obvious excitement for the day's adventure, photos next to the plane, hearing more of the pilot's stories, aiding his preparation for the flight, etc. We take off out of Carson City and begin to climb the approximate 2,000 feet to get over Spooner Pass, which brings us into the Lake Tahoe basin / mountain range. Our pilot, who has done this route dozens and dozens of times before, takes a direct path towards the pass. From our perspective as passengers, we note we are climbing and getting closer to the MTN side. From my perspective, I see we are over the tree, then closer to them. I assume we are along a valley wall. I looked around the cabin and at our pilot, who issued no sign of distress. As I look back out the window I see a manzanita bush, approximate 5 foot tall, and realize we are crashing. At this moment our pilot lets out a strong sheet. We crash and scream. The plane lands on a relatively flat area between the rolling peaks. This undoubtedly saved our lives. We learned in retrospect, this is what our pilot was silently searching for. While his straight trajectory to Spooner Pass was aggressive, the problem was emphasized when the foothill of the Sierra MTNS created 3 large down gusts which took out all our speed and lift. Hence the relatively sudden crash. As obvious as it may seem, this flat landing was very rare for this terrain, and had been forced to reach down on a hillside or harsher terrain, it would have been a much more violent an incident. Our second saving grace was the manzanita bushes we crashed on and lack of trees. This area is relatively moderately scattered with pine trees, but easily a single tree every 25 square feet. Had one tree been in our way, this would be a very different story. Likewise, had there not been a handful of manzanita bushes, our speed would have carried thrusting us into a row of trees approximately 100 foot further along our crash path. Upon crashing, one wing dug into the ground, which spun us around 180 degrees. As designed in most of these single-engine planes, the fuel is stored in the wings. The wing dug into the ground, dumped tired, and gasoline began spilling out, while our pilot immediately turned off all the electronics. Had the fuel flowed into the cabin instead of along the broken/downhill wing, again, this would be a different story. As soon as a pilot turned the electronics off, we ask each other if we're injured, and, seizing the moment, the pilot turns to my girlfriend and says happy birthday. The pilot grabs his essentials, a gun and a satellite phone. We had no service there, so this phone came in handy. We move approximately 20 yards uphill to a fire road as we wait for assistance. Humorously enough, a 4Runner with 2 young girls, blaring music, windows down, goes flying past us on a nearby fire road, and they don't see the shattered plane and crash path directly next to road. Not only once, but twice. 30 minutes later they drive back and miss us again. It was shocking. We wait for another 30 minutes, around an hour total, and up come the fire department. They are in nearly as much shock as we are. They ask my girlfriend and myself if we'd like to stay. We offer to help the pilot however we could, but there was nothing we could do. His next step was sorting out details of the crash and how to get the plane off the hillside. The pilot said we should get on our way. Aside from overkind's words about how pleased he was with the resolution of this event and everyone's health, honor the fireman drive us down the hill into a neighborhood that backups to these hills and the fire road network. Waiting there was 5 news networks. Prior to drive up to them, the fireman asked us if we'd like to comment. We declined and he informed the press. Following so, he drove us back to the airport, where we left a note for the drive thanking him for the decisions he made for saving our lives, other supporting words, and asked to be one of the first ones he takes back in the air once he gets a new plane. He never took us up upon getting a new plane, but we heard from him that insurance covered him very well, and he got a much nicer plane. Being my girlfriend's birthday, we decided to move forward as we would anyways, and went to sushi. We called our parents and let them know what happened / that everyone was alright. Although, when I called my mother she was driving through a tunnel, so all I was able to say was, "Mom, I was in a plane crash." And the call dropped. It was hilarious. I had already talked to my father and told him to call my mom to inform her as I needed to get back to the birthday dinner. Following dinner I had 22 missed calls from my mom. It's a running joke now. Aside from the fear of flying, there were no short-term repercussions from the incident, nor did we have much communication with our pilot. Months later we found out the BBC did a feature about plane crashes in the Sierra Nevada and they interviewed our pilot. For a very composed / stern military man, the 2 times I've seen him since, he immediately gets emotional and wet in the eyes when we discussed any topic. He said he'd let us know when that was released, but plus 3 years later we haven't heard from him. I should reach out. That's all that really comes to mind at the moment. There are other small details which I'm happy to relay. I'll answer as many questions as possible as well. Oh, and pardon any misspellings or poor grammar. I'm on my mobile and will attempt to clean this up in the morning. I was on a mid-sized fishing charter that sank approximately 100 miles east of Cape Hatteras with about 30 people on board. It ran into a dead fin whale, of all things, at a fairly high speed, and the impact broke the keel and caused it to capsize. It started to sink almost immediately. About half the people on board were thrown into the water by the collision, and there were a pretty good number of serious cuts and bruises, but no one was killed or anything. There was also a fair amount of initial panic about sharks that might be feeding on the carcass, but we were all able to climb out of the water on the sinking vessel until the crew got the life rafts inflated, so nothing came of that. Which is good, because there were sharks, oceanic whitetips. Quite aggressive. We were in the rafts about 14 hours altogether. It seemed longer at the time, because once the ship sank, that ocean got awfully big and empty. But we were never not out of contact with the Coast Guard. We were amply provisioned, and the rafts were fine, so we mostly just sat there wishing the whale would sink too, because it really stank. At least there were no flies, I suppose. If the weather had been bad, or if we had been further out to sea, it might have been bad, but these days the ocean is a pretty tame place even when something goes wrong. Modern navigational aids are so robust that it's just about impossible to get lost under normal adverse circumstances. Also, this wasn't us, but I found this while trying to find a similar image of what our whale looked like. Imagine the stench when that finally burst. We were not in the plane, we were under it on the ground. My brother remembers better than I the collision above us. In 1984, the wings of two Pipers collided in the air as spectators watched a kids' football game. One began crashing away from us, the other headed directly for us. Somebody authoritatively screamed, "Get away from the field. Run." Amazingly, within seconds, we all scrambled before the plane crashed in the field before us. It was a very close call. Men rushed over to the wreck, ultimately just throwing coats over the parts no person should see. The pilots of both planes perished. The other plane knocked out the city power that night. By candlelight, the event was discussed with the family. Later, I asked my dad, "Do you think we should tell him?" "Tell him what?" "That it wasn't two people. That it was just the same man in two pieces?" Brother told the man from the news that he saw two dead people. He was wrong. No, do not tell him. We never talked about it again. I didn't even think of this event until 27 years later, after a car wreck. I began to experience PTSD symptoms a few months after the head-on collision. My wreck, the planes crashing, and another memory of witnessing a deadly Ferris wheel accident became my prominent thoughts. Now, when I think about the plane falling on us, running for our lives amidst the scrawny boys in football gear, bellied coaches, referees with useless whistles bouncing off their chests, the Ferris wheel people holding on for their lives, strangers cheering "You can do it, hold on," and the letting go people, I try to add on the memories of the people that helped, how calm and sweet my parents were. Even though people died in terrible ways, and we saw terrible things, many survived. I must dignify the worst. I remind myself that I also saw many boring things, beautiful things as a child. Otherwise, I will forget to buy peanut butter and take the good papas for walks in the woods. In high school, I was on a charter bus coming home from a marching band competition. We were in rural Idaho going down the highway at about 75 miles per hour. The bus driver apparently had severe stomach pain, but didn't say anything, and eventually passed out from the pain. I was on the back of the bus sitting in the aisle with my back against the bathroom. My girlfriend was sitting next to me, and we were watching a movie with a laptop in the seat. I couldn't see out the window, because I was in the floor, but I remember it started getting bumpy, like we were pulling off the road, when I heard a girl scream, "We are crashing," and like 0.5 seconds after that registers, my face smacks the ceiling of the bus. I was knocked out, but remember waking up as the bus was rolling down the highway, and I remember thinking it looked like I was in a giant washing machine and people bodies were clothes being tossed around and around and around, and then everything went black again. I woke to my girlfriend screaming to get off her. I was laying on broken windows as the bus stopped rolling on its side. I stand up and see the seats up in the air and remember thinking something is not right here. As my mind pulled everything together into the reality of the faking bus just crashed, I look over and my friend is covered in blood, screaming and bleeding. I look down at my shirt and it's covered in blood. Nothing in my body hurt, so I started to panic that I was covered in blood that's not mine. I see another friend of mine tangled in the bus seats above me, and I help her down. The roof of the bus crushed in, and another friend of mine had her legs pinned underneath. I tried to lift the bus off her, and in my adrenaline-filled mind it seemed logical, and started getting pissed that the bus wouldn't budge. I remember her being very calm and saying, "Dude, you can't lift it. We will have to wait for the fireman to lift it off." At that point I decided I should get out of the bus. Well, those little tiny holes on the roof of the bus are not so easy to get through, and I remember getting stuck, and people have to shove me out. Had a point anyways. We were super lucky, because only 1 over 50 people on the bus died. Once I got to the hospital and the adrenaline started to die down, I realized my injuries, which were I had bit through my tongue and had a bruise that looked like a huge blood blister from us to my knee out in the perfect shape of a bus seat armrest. I'm 24 now and can drive without issues. The only exception is on the freeway when I'm next to a semi-truck. I start to panic that it's going to roll over and kill me. Luckily, my wife has caught on and will speed past the evil semi-trucks for me. Coming into this late, but I was living on Japan's Tohoku coast when the March 11th, 2011 earthquake and tsunami hit. I was actually taking a bath when the earthquake hit. I can't even tell you how intense it was. I literally couldn't stand up. It was the first earthquake that had actually frightened me since I came to Japan. I grew up in Alaska, so they were nothing new to me, and it was the first one that actually shook things down from my shelves. Japanese earthquake engineering is something else. I'm telling you. I knew it was a bad one, so I got out of the bath and dressed as quickly as I could. Since I lived right on the coast, I was already getting ready to leave when the get the hell to higher ground tsunami alarm started. I threw a few necessary things into a bag, pulled on my winter coat, and headed for the hills, quite literally. There were already officials on the ground directing people to safe places. The Japanese have this earthquake thing wired, and I ended up high on the hillside at a community rec center with a few hundred of my neighbors 20 minutes after the quake. The tsunami hit. It was unreal, the sheer volume of water that came in, and the power of it. I watched it destroy my neighborhood. The noise is what I remember most, how loud it was. I had to spend the night at the rec center, because it wasn't safe to go down. It was one of the more miserable nights of my life. There were constant aftershocks, the rec center was cold and loud, and I couldn't make any calls, so I knew my family had to be going nuts. I walked out the next day. There's no way to describe the destruction. I didn't even recognize the place I'd lived for over 2 years. My apartment building was completely gone. I ended up staying with friends on the less damaged side of town for the next week. It took almost 3 days for me to be able to get a message to my family that I was alive. The US government was useless, by the way. I finally managed to hitch a ride to the prefectural capital with some American Army people, and my company helped me by giving me my paycheck early and arranging a place to stay, which they also paid for. My family had some people working on things back home, and they got me a plane ticket. It took a bit of doing to get to Tokyo. A lot of rail lines were down, but I was able to get to Narita in time for my flight. It was more traumatic than I even realized at the time. When I got home, I heard a helicopter and had a full-on flashback. It took a long time for me to come to terms with it, but ultimately, I feel fortunate to have survived. On a summer vacation where all 7 of us stayed in a little tiny cabin at a tourist park whose name I forget, there was a freak weather system that spawned a gigantic tornado out of absolutely nowhere in the middle of the night. Neither of the two, of the news/weather services in the area saw it coming, and the park staff were caught flat-footed. When someone noticed it coming straight at the park, the alert was put out every way they possibly could. CB radio, Rural 911, State Trooper radios, red rocket flares, literally everything they could think of. The first clue we had of anything was waking up at the dead of night to a park ranger shouting at us to get up and evacuate. We got our shoes on and some jackets, and booked it, like we were charging up the beach on D-Day, complete with sirens screaming, and the sky a sickly green and the wind roaring. Everyone got herded to the only available shelter within miles, a concrete official building of some kind. I remember a poster for food stamps because it had a picture of a kid who looked my age. That was one of the few times dad or mom got genuinely scared in front of us kids, and that included other times we woke up to tornadoes at midnight. Hundreds of strangers were all packed in, chattering and trying to look decent in their PJs. Mom was mortified. Someone had brought a big black dog who was taking things quite well and all us kids petted in point. The tornado ended up swerving and chewing along the edge of the park property. Ike, instead of tearing right through the park proper. Some people got broken windshields, but our van just got a few dings from thrown rocks. Things could have easily gone a lot worse. Very late to the party as well, but here is my near-death experience point. I was working in a lab full of compressed gas and many chemicals. I always followed safety protocol, which definitely saved my life that day. I was asked to return a nearly full 6,000-pound argon tank to the chemistry department that day. We had not been trained in cylinders, and my understanding was that screwing the valve closes the bottle. The delivery company had tired of returning cylinders, so they had put a special bypass around the regulator to make refills easier. Long story short, I basically detonated a 6,000-pound mom next to my face. I remember a small hiss and thinking, now that is strange. I don't recall that ever happening. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hallway in the fetal position, screaming in pain. I had been knocked completely unconscious and the argon had displaced all the air on the floor. A lab mate dragged me out by my arm. I had sustained a severe concussion, so much argon had been forced through my skin and into my brain. When I touched my skin, it was like foam, full of tiny sacks of argon. I required an overpass stay in the ICU and 20 staples to my head. The metal had just grazed under my chin, cutting it. My throat was nearly ripped through by a piece of metal moving with the force of a rifle slug. My lab mates calculated that for me. The explosion was so loud, I could not hear anything for at least several minutes, and my ears ring to this day. Years later, if you're out there, Phil, thank you. You saved my life. That day. Edit. Bomb. Phil's mom. Whatever. My boat ran aground at night on the Goodwin Sands. A sunken beach, which sometimes is above water, sometimes below depending on the tide. It's a graveyard of literally hundreds of boats. It's like sinking sand. It's a long story, but we were eventually rescued by 2 boats and a Royal Air Force helicopter. Edit. Sorry, I was a bit drunk, and it was Halloween, so didn't write the long version. I'm quite an experienced sailor, having worked professionally for many years around Europe and the Med. But this was many years ago, and was literally my first trip out on a yacht. I was doing a 5-day training course and we were on our last leg back, sailing from Calais, France, to Ramsgate, in Kent, UK. It was nighttime in February, so quite cold. The wind was northeasterly, and blowing around a F6. Quite windy, not too bad. The sea state was quite rough, and as a result the crew all got seasick, including the skipper. Luckily I didn't, and still don't get seasick. So I was the only able crew on the yacht. I was fetching water for the guys and girls who were chucking up over the side. The skipper, captain, refused to leave the helm, the upshot of which he effectively stopped navigating. We were trying to sail to the north of the Goodwin Sands, and then westward into Ramsgate. However, due to a few mitigating factors, the tide had turned, and we weren't making way to northward. The skipper wasn't aware of this, and decided to head into Ramsgate Harbour, whose town lights were just visible in the distance. The skipper stuck the engine on to make up some speed, so we were reaching under sail and engine. The wind was almost behind us, so we were going quite fast. Little did I know that we were heading straight into a deadly, and rather famous, ship graveyard. As it was rough, we were all clipped on via out harnesses. Luckily, there was a massive bang, and the yacht pitched sideways onto the hull and we all tumbled over to one side on the yacht, all dangling off our harnesses. It was difficult to tell what had happened. At the time I had no idea. Waves broke over the cockpit and hull, and flipped the yacht onto the other side. In the moonlight I still couldn't tell what had happened, but now I was clinging onto the guardrail on the port side, except it was now above me. My harness was underwater in the cockpit, and I was standing on the binnacle, the thing that the ship's wheel/helm is attached to. The others were all clipped on the port side, so their harnesses were nearer to them. Waves continues to rock the yacht, and I could tell that it was the mast that was stopping the yacht from rolling over. The mast was smashing and digging into the sands as we were rolling. The sands looked like a shallow beach, with breaking surf, and we were facing across it, and could see dry land a few miles downwind. Unfortunately, the wind and tide were pushing us deeper into the sands. The skipper managed to get to the VHF in the companionway and radio Mayday. I knew very little about sailing, but I knew Mayday meant we were in a serious trouble. The Kent RNLI lifeboat station in Ramsgate launched 2 boats and radioed for an RAD helicopter. This I learned later. Unfortunately, it wasn't a straight run for the boats as they too had to navigate around the sand. Strangely, the dynamic on the yacht had changed dramatically during this time. I genuinely believed the mast would break and the yacht would roll over, trapping us under the yacht. The skipper had all but given up. He looked beaten and dejected. There was an Italian guy who kept blaming the skipper and complaining. Me and another female crew member literally shook hands and said it was nice knowing you. Although we were quite upbeat about it, I remember thinking I've had a decent life. It wouldn't be a total tragedy. Point anyway, we saw the lifeboat in the distance. I had unclipped as either the yacht would roll over. I had it in my head I'd jump/swim for it. As I was unclipped, I had to go get the flares. They were in the underwater locker. So I had to jump down, hold on and get the flare box out from the submerged locker. I got the box and climbed back up. It was only then I realized how cold I was, and although the box is designed to be opened easily, I could barely use my hands. The female crew member had to light the flare, a red one, to help guide the lifeboats. This lit the whole scene up in quite a scary light, which didn't fill me with much hope. It looked like a death scene. The crew struggled to get to us because of the rough surf. I think they attempted to anchor off the sands and pay out chain in order to get to us. However, the surf was too rough. They radioed us and told us to go below as they were going to attempt a rocket-propelled rope. Everyone got below, but I remember thinking, if the yacht flips, we're dead. So I stuck by the companionway, laying on the port cabin door, like it was a bed. Point, the rope was fired, but snagged in outrigging. If they tried to pull us off using that, we would have been dismasted, which would have been bad. Point, this is when the helicopter arrived. They asked us if we could prepare to be winched off, and all I could remember thinking was that my stuff would be left, like my iPod and camera, and I'd never get them back. So I said I'd prefer to stay with the yacht and try another way. Weirdly, everyone listened to me. I'm not sure why. I was the least experienced. I can only think I was the only one that wasn't acting in a constructive way. The helicopter crew managed to get a line from a lifeboat and drop it onto the yacht. We attached the line and they dragged our yacht off the sands. The second it refloated, it smashed back on the sands as we went through the surf. I was sure the keel was going to be ripped off. This happened a few times till we were in deep enough water. After a short tour, lifeboatmen leapt aboard from a riband room control of the yacht. We were taken back to Ramsgate and moored in the harbor. We slept in the yacht club and went back to see the state of the yacht in the morning. It was pretty badly smashed up, although I was really impressed how much of a beating it took without totally falling apart. Point, I've since learned you always stay with the boat. Always. Turns out, if I had jumped into the sea, I would have certainly drowned. The sands would have sucked me in, and the surf drowned me. The lifeboats would never have got to me. I wrote a diary of sorts of the events that led me to be stranded on an island after a Cat 5 hurricane. I was there studying medicine. Sunday, September 17th, day 0. It was announced that Tropical Storm Maria was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, likely to become Category 3 by the time it hits Dominica, the island where I'm currently living and studying medicine. It is moving westwards like most hurricanes. I quickly read and dismiss these emails as I have more important things to attend to, namely an exam tomorrow, a mini one which counts for 9% of my mark. I get another email later in the day announcing that school is now going to be closed. I breathe a sigh of relief. Truthfully, I wanted a day longer to study for this Monday, September 18th, day 1. 9 AM I slept restlessly thinking about what will happen with the marks from my exam. Will the marks be moved to my final? Will it be postponed? I woke up to my landlord knocking on my door. Wilco, my landlord, is usual a pretty happy and positive guy. This is the first time I'm seeing real concern on his face. He tells me in a serious tone that he is a civil engineer and that he built out apartments to withstand a category 2 hurricane, but not a category 3. He fears that in a category 3 the roof will come off. He says that he has already talked to the downstairs tenants and they are okay with me staying with them. 10 am. I decide that I'm going to prepare a little better for this hurricane. I already have 15 of water and about a month's worth of food for myself, but just to be extra safe, I call my friends who live just north of the school in a building that always struck me as very strong and well built. It was built from cinder blocks filled with concrete and rubber. I ask them if I can sleep on their couch during the hurricane and worst case scenario a few more days in case I need to clean my apartment. I make 3 trips with my motorcycle up to their place with all my water, 3 days of clothes, water, and food. 12 p.m. I talk with my family about my living arrangements. I research things like my longitude and latitude, my address and my altitude above sea level, 111 feet or so according to Google. My primary concern is still what will happen to my exam. There was little to indicate that a hurricane was approaching. Occasionally the wind would gust, and there were periods of rain, but all things considered we could have written our exams today had the school not been preparing for the coming storm. They had done the same a week and a half prior for Hurricane Irma and that had passed north of us, and that was not a problem. 5 p.m. me and my friends gather in their living room and start obsessing over the track of the storm. Evidently the hurricane itself has slowed down and will take a longer time to pass by Dominica. I check the National Hurricane Center website and find that it has been upgraded to a category 4. This only strengthens our obsessive checking. We understand this new development makes the storm worse, but unsure about how much. One of my friends, Avery, shows us a video comparing the damages of different categories of hurricanes. This quells our curiosity and makes our anxiety worse. I begin creating a Hurricane Maria playlist on Spotify and filling it with songs that are appropriate. The winds and rain have picked up now and are consistent and strong. The lights in the house flicker and dim at random intervals and I look over to my friends, whose faces mirror the apprehension I'm now feeling. 7 p.m. the power goes out at our apartment and we hear the generators in the neighboring apartments kick in. We can still access their Wi-Fi. We accept that the power is probably not coming back anytime soon, and we light some candles. Our mood is suddenly solemn. We study by candlelight, partly to stay busy and partly because we are neurotic med school students. We wonder if we will get to write our exam tomorrow. The wind is loud now. We can hear the turbulence of it past trees and other structures in gusts and bursts. We expect the eye of the hurricane to pass by us around 8:30 p.m. Since the last time we checked 8 p.m. the winds are extremely fierce now. The gusts we experienced before are gone and replaced with a non-stop wind. This wind forces water past sealed window frames on the door, causing water to drip down to the floor. I force a towel underneath the door frame to try and stem the flow of water. We decide to move all of our beds into the living room. It seems like the safest place in the house, but really I don't want to be alone. I don't admit this, but turn to my friend Z and tell her I'm glad that I came tonight. She smiles and says she is as well. We remark that this is the most extreme weather any of us has ever experienced in our lives. 9 p.m. I get a text from my mom that says that Maria has been upgraded to a category 5. I pause to reread the text and relay the news to my friends. Avery gets a text at around the same time saying that we should expect the eye of the hurricane, the worst of it, to hit us at around 11:30 p.m. 10 minutes later we both lose service on our phones. We cannot make or receive calls or texts. We are now no longer in contact with anyone in the outside world and I don't think we could leave, even if we wanted to. Water begins seeping into the living room and we decide to move into the kitchen around 10:30 p.m. 11 p.m. the hurricane has gotten much worse since 9. Brief views out of the small window above the kitchen doors look otherworldly, in the literal sense of the word. I cannot recognize this weather as anything Earth-like I have experienced. If someone has showed me a video of what I was seeing I would probably claim Photoshop. The lights from the surrounding buildings reveal that the trees that were easily 10-15 feet tall have bent over at about 3-foot mark. I see a piece of sheet metal 7 feet by 10 feet, a piece that could easily hold my weight, contorted around the exposed trunk of a nearby coconut tree. It would take an immense force to bend this metal, and the storm is turning it into origami. I see the metal shift slightly, catching air underneath it. It briefly rises, before it disappears out of sight. It seems more like an invisible hand yanked it out of my view, rather than the wind. Tuesday, September 19th. Monday, September 19th, day 2, 12 am. The winds have quietened. I and the other think that we must be passing by the eye of the storm. We decide to put on a movie, Bad Moms. To pass the time. 2 am we decide that we should try and get some rest. We turn off the movie. The winds have picked up again to the frightening levels we saw before. We just want this to be over. Any curiosity I had about what it would be like is gone. This is terrifying. The funny thing about the winds at these speeds is that they interact with anything to make a noise. Whistling, a roar, banging. Right now I'm hearing voices in the wind. They are calling for help. I look outside and see no one. I lie down again, trying to convince myself it's nothing. 4 am I wake up to the sounds of voices again. There is less wind to drown it out now. They are definitely human, and they are asking for help, with greater urgency and volume each time. I rush to the kitchen door and pause for a second before opening it. The wind whips it out of my hand and it's pinned against the wall outside. I step under the roof in the porch and yell to ask if everything is okay towards the source of the cries. She says that she's looking for John and that she will be alright. I give her a thumbs up and pry the door closed. I lie back down and manage to get some sleep. 8:30 am we hear knocking from the front door. I jump up and get to it and see my friend's landlord through the window. I try to open the door and it won't budge. I use both hands and all the force I can muster and it finally comes open. I squint as the light from outside hits me. It's still overcast, but bright enough that the sun is peeking through. The wind and the rain are mostly gone, but I can see a few darker looking clouds in the distance. Mr. Anderson, the landlord, asks us if we are okay. We reply yes, and then he asks if there is any damage. Miraculously there is none, other than the flooding. He manages a weak grin and says good. He then turns around to look at the debris outside, and his look becomes more severe. Past him, I see the power lines are now at a 45-degree angle and their wires are laying strewn on the grounds lying above his car and the trees. There are large pieces of sheet metal that must weigh upwards of 150 pounds wrapped around the now knocker-over telephone poles. They creak and sigh in the wind. We look towards his house and see that his roof is gone. His daughter's guitar is dangling by a few strings, is broken at the neck, and is making hollow sounds when it hits the wall. My motorcycle, which I had previously parked on the porch, has now tipped over and is lying on its side, several feet from where I had left it. The most striking thing I notice are the mountains that are in view. Usually they are a deep green and look lush. Now they are a grayish brown and have taken on a spiky appearance I cannot yet identify. I lived in a very small town in Ohio, and we had a couple of huge F5 tornadoes tear through the town. One destroyed the local shops in town and even killed a few people. The other came through a new developing neighborhood of the town's wealthy population and headed straight for my house. It didn't seem that large of a storm, so I decided to take a quick shower. When the sirens went off, I knew I should probably get to the basement, but they were tested often and so I didn't hurry. My dad yelling to haulers got me a little worried though, so I wrap a towel around myself and hurry down the stairs. At the bottom was my older brother with the front door flung wide open. He's standing there in absolute awe, watching this wall of darbies just fly by. Entire roofs are being lifted from houses and so much useless attic crap is now rushing around. It sounds like a train, and all at once quiet as dad slams the door shut, pulling my brother back inside. We rushed down to the basement and waited out. My only real thought at the time was, well, my room on the second floor may have been destroyed, so I guess I'll just keep wearing this towel for now. It was over quickly. The tornado stopped right as it got to my house. Much to my delight, my room was under shade. Most of the house was under shade. When my dad built the house, he made sure to put hurricane straps on it just in case. Totally worth it. We had to replace like 4 shingles and repair a few dents in the car, but we got incredibly lucky. Some people lost everything but their lives. Some lost more. I'll never forget looking out the front door to see everything that was once there now shattered across the face of a tornado. And I'll never forget the sound I don't know if this count, but I will tell my story when the earthquake in Chile, that was 8.4. It was at 3:30 am or something, and if it wasn't for my mother I probably wouldn't wake up. I'm a heavy sleeper, so it's kind of normal for me. Well, after I woke up we, as family, gathered at the main entrance of the house and we waited for my dad to finish deciding what to do. You see, he's from the Chilean Navy and my mother is a medic cop, so they were expected to deploy as soon as the sun came out. After a bunch of mini earthquakes, after something like that shake, the earth still moves, and it could be potentially more dangerous than the initial one. The sun came out, and we packed as many food, water, and clothes that we could, and we departed to the Navy base where my dad works. We traveled through broken roads, literally the road cut in half or holes as big as the length of 2 trucks, and we were getting close to the base. At one moment we saw the road flooded, so we thought that it was a water connection that broke underground. We kept pushing forward, not even expecting what it really was. We took a detour through a hill, and when we could see the coast, we discovered that the flood was not water from a pipe, but however it was water from the sea. At Tsunami Point we rushed to the base, but it was no use. Everything was destroyed. You could saw containers on the second floor from the nearby houses and sardines splashing from nearby pools of water. We kept going a little bit and we dropped my dad near the beach at the base, looking at the sea how it went back and forward, and we all cried when we left because of the fear of another tsunami, and my dad could get caught in at point. After that we, somehow dodging every looter that went crazy, returned home and barricaded the entrance to the villa with the neighbors. We were still in fear of another big earthquake, and that a group of looters would stop with guns in the villa, and went berserk on us. I must say, my mother kept us really calm despite the situation. I also have good memories from that incident, because we got to know our neighbors. We are now friends, and we stay like kings, because there was not electricity, and every home needed to eat whatever they had in the freezers. I remember eating lobster, wild pig, deer, etc. and that's it, at least for me. I had friends that lost everything, people that lived near the coast, and others that needed to hang food to looters, so they would not get assaulted. Edit. Broken English that I fixed. Not English speaker, so, yeah. My 9-year-old self, and about 7 of my dad's friends and him were on a 36-foot contender fishing a day before a tournament in Bimini Point. We woke up about 6 am, and got on the boat in Fort Lauderdale and headed across to Bimini, and started trolling around 9 am, and it was a pretty good day all day, except while we were out there was these 3 storms hanging out, and we didn't pay much attention to them. Well, around 4 p.m. when we're getting ready to head back to Fort Lauderdale, these 3 storms surround us, and we're stuck right in the middle of them. One thing I remember is looking up at the captain fishing on the bow and his raincoat being almost torn off him from the wind. We took a wave over the transom, and were getting out there fast. I got down in the gunwale of the boat to hide from the wind and rain. I remember looking up and seeing close to 10-foot waves breaking, and waves coming over the bow. It wasn't real bad until one wave brought enough water to knock one of my dad's friends down and push him to the back of the boat. The captain was trying to drive straight into the waves, and contenders are very bow heavy boats, so almost every wave was coming over until eventually he figured out that he was gonna sink us at that rate. I remember looking at the back of the boat and seeing knee-deep water, and my dad opening the tuna door to let it out. We rode with the waves until the storm finally passed. It took around an hour to pump out all the water, but it was a pretty scary experience. I don't know if this will count, so please delete this if you want, but I survived the Los Alamos/Cerro Grande fire, New Mexico. We were camping up near Jemez Springs at the time, and the Forest Service was doing a controlled burn a ways away from our campsite. Controlled burns are necessary to prevent really bad fires, but there hadn't been one in a while, and it quickly grew out of control thanks to excessive kindling, dry tress and pine needles, and high winds. Luckily we were in a marked camping spot, and we got woken up at 4 am by some forest rangers or sheriffs. Really dark, couldn't really see who exactly it was, but they said we needed to pack up and be out in 30 minutes. A giant fire was headed our way. They said they were extremely serious, and if we weren't leaving by that time they would drag us out and leave our crap there. That really got me woken up. So we get dressed super quick, gather up as much of our stuff as we can, Don't even worry about folding the tent nice or anything, and throw all our crap into the car. We gathered all the stuff we could find, in a panic now, in the dark with our flashlights, and throw it in, and hit the road point as we were leaving. The fire crossed the road, and we had to drive through it. Freaking never want to do that again. We were basically driving through the smoke blindly for about 20 seconds as fire on both sides was around. Intense. We actually went the wrong way. We were supposed to head south, as the fire was going east towards Los Alamos, and we went on that road. Didn't think clearly. We were thinking to take refuge there, but they were evacuating Los Alamos at the time as well. We stopped for gas and grabbed a gas station breakfast before sitting in traffic for 3 hours, and the sun came up and the fire was cresting over the last hill right as we left the town and got into the freeway and headed south towards Hispaniola/Santa Fe. It was very harrowing. Nobody died, but lots of people lost their homes, very similar to what recently happened in Santa Rosa, California. We were very lucky those sheriffs/rangers woke us up. Thank God for those hard-working folks. Other campers didn't pay attention and were forced out. I know as we were leaving the campsite lots of people were just moseying around, not taking things seriously till the deputies came back to force people to leave. I was so panicked ESP as we were trying to leave the town because we were stuck in traffic with a fire on its way. Luckily nobody was hurt. So I don't consider my story very terrible, but that might be due to some of the other things I've grown up around and work with. I dunno. Point at the time my father, 45, my 2 brothers, 14 and 16, my buddy, 25, and myself, 24, were on a week-long camping trip deep into the woods with canoe portaging and whatnot. The kind where you have to alert the forestry dudes where you're going, and what color your canoes are, and when to come looking for you if you don't check in, that kind of thing. The trip in was great. We packed beer instead of food, and relied on fishing mostly as we knew the area pretty well, and were confident we wouldn't starve. We brought GoPro cameras and my buddy's DSLR for some amazing pictures and a great video that was posted for friends and family. So we were on our way back canoeing up a river, 8 kms or so long, and probably 1 wide, when we noticed the wind had really started to pick up. Now the river was pretty sheltered due to all of the forest around it, so we didn't notice much in terms of waves, but we did feel the current that kept us almost stationary as we paddled against it. My father and brothers were in the newer canoe and my buddy and I were in the old Coleman $100 special that weighed a ton, so they started creeping away and getting more and more distance on us while we pretty much sat still and even started moving backwards for a while, all the time paddling our ass off trying to keep moving. We contemplated just pulling onto shore and waiting for the wind to die down a bit, since we were not actually moving, but we were too stubborn to quit, and eventually made it to the end and the next portage area point. As we were launching the canoe into the last big lake, we took a look just around the point to see how the wind was blowing in the open unprotected area. The lake is about 10 kilometers wide and circular, so the wind has plenty of area to really make a difference. We started to notice some white caps near the center of the lake and figured we should stick as close to shore as possible so we wouldn't lose or lock it if the canoe flipped. We weren't too worried as it was still a lake and we didn't think too much could really happen. At this point we had long lost sight of my father and brothers and assumed they had probably made it across the lake already and were packing up the trucks. We made it barely past the point when the wind hit us. The first gust almost flipped us on its own and the waves made it pretty much impossible to paddle. We pretty much immediately turned back to the shore and just basically tried not to flip while the waves pushed us into shore. When we got to shore we looked out and noticed the whole lake was basically a sea of white caps with waves crashing more than a meter high. We noticed one of the boating boys was partially submerged in the water about 3 kilometers out with only the yellow top sticking out of the water. It was pretty much luck that we had come around the point during a brief calm point, otherwise the canoe would have been flipped pretty much instantly. So we collected our things as best we could and decided we would just walk along the beach the couple kms to the trucks and drive one back to our kit. Frowned upon, but we figured people would understand. While we were walking back we noticed a couple of campers rushing up and down the beach looking out into the lake. If you've ever seen someone distressed, then you know you can tell something is wrong even from a significant distance, and these people were definitely upset. As we're walking and watching the campers, we start looking out into the water to see if we can figure out what's bothering them so much. It takes a couple seconds before we realize that the boy is probably not a boy, but is probably someone's flipped kayak or canoe or something. As we realize that the camper's friends are probably the ones in the water, the male camper stops running back and forth on the shore and starts running into the water, probably thinking he can swim out with a life preserver on and help them. As he starts into the water, my buddy and I start running down the beach to see if there's anything we can do. We reach the female camper and start asking what happened and how many people are in the water. We've worked together in situations like this before and have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. She starts saying that there were 3 of them and that she doesn't know who they were, and that her husband, the male camper who rushed into the water, isn't a very good swimmer. Great. At this point I'm stripping down. It was late in the season and the water is cold, but wet clothes are gonna be a hell of a lot colder and a lot heavier, and I start thinking about how we're gonna have to probably now save 4 people if we can get the forestry guys to launch their boat and let us go along. Point. While she's explaining that she's called the forestry guys and they are on their way, I come to the horrible realization that my father and brothers aren't anywhere to be found, and they are probably the people in the water, and that if it is them, then they've been in the water for almost 2 hours. At this point I just start out into the water hoping that they've been able to hang on to some of their kit and stay floating above the waves. Life preservers and jackets are great, but when you're only wearing ones rated for a little canoeing, they don't do much in big waves. You still end up having to fight to stay above water. I make it to maybe waist height before I have to start swimming because the larger waves are above my head. My buddy makes it out to about neck level before he calls out saying that he can't make it out any farther without being a liability. He's not as strong of a swimmer. He does a quick mental check with me asking if I'm sure I can make it, make sure that I'm capable of the swim, and that I'm focused and not panicking because it's family. Then I'm off again using him as a reference to make sure I'm going straight out towards the flipped canoe. I make another 100 meters or so and find the camper with the life jacket pretty confused and in shock. He's really upset, talking about how he lost the people and can't see the canoe anymore cause the waves are so high. Takes me a second to get him turned around and swimming in the direction of my buddy. Another couple 100 meters or so I find my 16-year-old brother hanging onto the stove bag with the empty propane tanks. He doesn't recognize me or the fact that he's in the water, shock, and just keeps asking what happened. Takes me a little longer to get him repeating that he is swimming towards my buddy who is actively jumping up out of the water with the waves to be seen. Eventually he starts self-talk and starts swimming towards him. I make it another 100 meters and see my youngest brother hanging onto one of the rucksacks with the air mattress. He's calling out for my father who is nowhere to be seen. I catch only the slightest and luckiest of glimpses of a hand on the side of something floating. I honestly don't even remember what it was. Just that it was enough to contrast my father's hand against it. I swim over and pull my father onto his back, so he's above water. He's bleeding a little and starts telling me about how it's okay and that the air mattress wasn't able to hold us both up, thinking of my younger brother, and that it's okay if he drowns, but to not let go of the air mattress. Takes me the better part of the swim back with my father and brother to convince them that we're all going to be okay and that no one is drowning. We get back to my buddy, who helps me drag them out of the water. I look out and see that the forestry guys are coming towards us talking with the 2 campers, so I sit down and start to feel how tired I am. Then I hear my buddy start yelling at the forestry guys, so I go to see what is happening. Turns out they've been there for a while and didn't bother to launch the boat. Apparently it was too dangerous, which was understandable I guess, but they didn't even bother to call the paramedics or emergency crews or anything. They just completely froze up and didn't do a thing except stand on the beach and watch. Takes another minute or so before my buddy convinces them that they should go back to their truck and bring out the blankets and cookies and stuff from the trauma kit, which they just completely forgot about. About an hour or so goes by before everyone's kinda back to normal. Eventually all the gear washed up onto shore except for a pair of Oakleys. My father has too many pairs anyway, and we packed everything up and drove out and home. My brothers are still a little shaken 2 years later, and my father, like me, I'm sure either hasn't been impacted by the event or has buried it along with all the other things that we just simply get over. My buddy doesn't talk about it, except the odd time as a joke, kinda what we all do, so I'm sure has in the same boat. Haha, puns are funs. TLDR. Camping trip almost turned into a canoe drowning. Forestry guys were just as lost as you'd expect. Beware of crazy waves. On my 16th birthday my dad, friend and I were leaving my friend's ranch in Texas. Had a guys weekend to celebrate in our family's Piper Cherokee 180. All of our friends were lined up alongside the runway watching us take after head home. Everything was going fine, and then once we got up over the trees about 300 feet in the air the wind turned and was at our back and took all of the lift away from us. So the plane started falling really fast, not gliding. There was absolutely no lift, so we just fell. There's nothing you can do in that situation in this plane with such little power either. We hit the trees and the wing on my side, passenger side, of the plane got completely torn off leaving a huge hole in the fuselage where I was sitting. Then the plane rolled because the wing was gone and we landed nose down upside down in the woods. The next thing I know I'm hanging upside down in my seat and it's the weirdest feeling ever. I describe it like in war movies when a bomb or grenade goes off and suddenly it's silent, ears ringing, everything seems to be in slow motion. That's exactly what I felt like until slowly I started hearing my dad yelling to get out of the plane. I didn't realize his side of the plane was going up in flames very fast. So I went to crawl out of the plane, but my seatbelt was stuck on something, and for the life of me, I couldn't get it undone. But my dad said he looked up, and the only thing he saw, like it was glowing or something, was my belt buckle stuck on the strap. So he reached up and ripped it off, and out I went. Then my dad went to escape and said he heard my friend yelling that he was stuck in the back seat because the seats wouldn't fold forward. They were jammed because the roof had crushed down on top of them, not allowing them to fold forward and out of the way. My dad says he doesn't remember this part, but my friend says he will never forget it. He says my dad reached back and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and pulled him through the seats and threw him out of the plane. He has no recollection of that. So by this time the cabin of the plane is completely engulfed in flames and my dad is still inside. He doesn't know where we are. He thinks we got stuck in a tree or something, so when he goes to escape he does a weird dead fish dive out of the side of the plane. So seeing that he's on fire and still halfway inside the plane, I ran back into the fire and pulled him out, and we all took off running. We made it about 40 feet away when the gas in the wing on the other side of the plane that hadn't been ripped off caught fire and exploded, blowing us all on the ground. All of this sounds like it took a while, but we were out of the plane in 15 seconds after hitting the ground. The only injuries were to my knee and all I needed were 20 staples and some stitches, and I'm completely fine today. The FAA said they've never seen a crash like ours, that one anyone has walked away from, and two, that everyone walked away from and without almost any injuries. It's a complete miracle that we're alive today. Well, I was involved in a freak car accident. It was the first time I went out with my friend and her family, mum, dad, sister and aunt with cousins. I was 19 at the time. We were going to go see the rain in valleys during rain season. We went around the areas, then found a valley with a small lake. We parked at the top and made our way down to the lake. The children were playing. There was a family on the right side of the lake with their daughter playing in the area between both groups. I heard a noise that confused me and turned around to look up at the road. All I saw was a car flying off the edge and falling into the small valley. Wheels still turning, it hit the gravel ground and flipped a couple of times over my friend's family. They had ducked to the ground because there was no time to move. It finished flipping and was coming towards me. I was frozen just watching, not processing any of this. I suddenly felt a push and I fell into the lake. The car had swerved to avoid the lake in the exact spot I was standing in and was now stopped a few meters away. I was able to get out of the lake, but my knees gave way and I collapsed to the ground covered in mud and missing a shoe. The driver got out of the car in full army dress He closed the door, opened it again, and got his wallet out of the car and stood there. Then came the screams and wails. There was a little girl laying on the ground between my friend's family. At first we all thought it was her young cousin, 5 to 7 years old, but then realized it was the girl from the other family. She probably was hit at the moment the car hit the ground and flew several feet to land between us. She was bleeding from her nose and ears. Her family was hysterical. We were all shocked, and they kept trying to pick her up and flailing her about in panic. My friend's parents convinced them to give her to them because we didn't know how badly injured she was, while we waited for the police and emergency vehicles to show up. People passing on the road actually took out their phones and started recording the scene. I remember thinking, how can people be this insensitive? The girl was taken to her mother, where she died 5 minutes before the ambulance arrived. We drove back, covered in mud. My friend's parents covered in the girl's blood. The next day I couldn't walk, and others in our group had unexplained injuries. It turned out that I was hit in the hip by something that flew off the car. I know this isn't a plane crash, but it was devastating to all involved. This happened 9 years ago, and I still think about it every now and then. I have one not quite as extreme as a plane crash, but something that has oddly left long-term effects. I was 20 years old and worked for a large publicly traded oil and gas company on a freighting crew. We would start work at 1 AM and finish up around 4 to 6 PM each day. On this specific day I was the passenger in a dump truck overloaded with sand, and, I soon found out, an irresponsible driver. The dump truck rolled over at, investigators estimated, 76 miles per hour. These dump trucks often get stuck in the mud and get pushed/pulled to well sites by large bulldozers. As such, they had these massive front bumpers, and when it tipped over that dug into the pavement and acted as a pivot point, spinning the truck 180 degrees as we slid down the highway. We took out 4 telephone poles and almost 500 feet of guardrail between the 2 sides of the road as we bounced back and forth. The dump truck only had a lap belt in the passenger seat, similar to an airline seat belt, as opposed to a standard 3-point seat belt. When we rolled over I slipped most of the way out of the seat belt, landing on the gear shifter with my ribs, and also shoulder to shoulder with the driver. I broke his collarbone and bruised a couple of my ribs. I got road rash from the broken out window on my forearm, shoulder blades and a little on my cheek, where I didn't fully protect my face with my arm. Was quite the experience. But what I never expected were the lasting effects, and I can't imagine people that go through even more traumatic events. To this day, 11 years later, I still get extremely uneasy of right-hand turns. Even more so if I'm not driving. But it doesn't matter what I'm in. My four-wheeler, motorcycle, truck, airplane, boat, anything that moves at a decent speed, I will get an uneasy feeling when we take a right-hand turn, and it's really odd to me that it's stuck around for this long. I was in a small plane accident about 8 years ago. My dad has a Cessna, and we picked a weekend and flew down on a Friday to Mississippi to check out Ole Miss and grab some BBQ. Our visit was fun, skipped around to a few towns in Manuscript, and headed back to St. Louis on Sunday. I was flying right seat and my dad was piloting. He's an instructor and has his commercial rating, and the plane is a taildragger, different than conventional tricycle gear aircraft, and in constant danger of the tail kicking out during high-speed ground maneuvers. As we descended to the runway, something felt wrong as soon as we touched the ground, and all of a sudden our tail flew way out to the left and the plane tried to flip. In that moment, as our plane tried to flip to the left, I saw the ground coming at my dad's head fast. I had a weird, time is slowing down, kind of moment, not exactly seeing your life flash before your eyes, but it was as if I knew what was about to happen and accepted that we'd probably die. Our wing got mangled, but stayed together and prevented us from fully flipping and from any injury. All of a sudden we were horizontal, still strapped in, at a dead spot, and had gas leaking down on us. I quickly asked if he was okay. He said yes, opened my door which was on top, and helped us get out and leave the area as soon as possible in case of a fire. We walked down the runway in absolute shock and waited for rescue crews. Unfortunately, the local news got there far before anybody came to help. Finally the fire trucks and ambulances came, though we didn't require any care. It shook us both up pretty badly, and my dad second guessed every move he made that day for weeks, until the FAA determined he was not at fault. The landing gear failed, and there was nothing he could have done. It took a while, but he got back into the cockpit and still enjoys flying every time he can. The incident briefly caused a fear of flying for me, unsurprisingly. I realized, however, how impractical being afraid of airplanes would be for the rest of my life. So it actually inspired me to conquer the fear and get my pilot's license. I finished it last year, and I'm currently working toward my instrument rating. It was a crazy event that I hope to never relive, but we got very lucky, and I'm thankful every day to be alive. I'm late here, but that's fine, because my story is not as bad as others. I survived a dam break and flooding/tornado a few years back. I live in rural Iowa, but travel 30 minutes to my job at a nursing home. That day was super normal. It was nice outside, and we took a few residents to the courtyard to enjoy the warm sun. After supper, it was getting cloudy outside, and it was very dark all around us, which is strange, because usually you can see the storm coming in from one direction and the opposite is still sunshine and white clouds. Not today. Every direction was pitch black. A little while later, my coworker got an urgent call from her mother telling her she wasn't allowed to leave work. Her mother worked a town over 15 miles because there was a funnel cloud near them. Right after that, my friend texts me that there is a tornado on the highway on the other side of town, and he is sitting in his car. By now we have stopped putting residents in their rooms, have closed all blinds, and put blankets around them. We are watching the news, and there's 6 active tornado cells in our small county. Well, now there's nothing to do but wait. Me and my coworker go to the window overlooking the south to see if we can see any funnel cloud/tornadoes in that direction. When we see something else, the drain in our parking lot down to the city sewer is pumping out water. Within the next 30 minutes our parking lot is flooded. Most of the cars are almost completely underwater, and it's still rising closer to the front door. Now, the river in this town has flooded before, but we are on higher ground and at least a mile away, so it's never hit this building before. The police or someone calls our nursing home and orders an evacuation, except one problem: we can't get out, let alone get disabled old people out. The parking lot is completely flooded. A couple hours pass by and the parking lot has emptied enough. Water must have ran downhill and sewer stopping pumping it in that an ambulance could come in. We evacuated all the residents and went home around 12 AM. I had to sleep at a friend's house that night because all the roads out of town were blocked off due to flooding. All had bridges flooded over. Anyway, the reason for the flooding was a dam breakage, and they ordered us to evacuate because they thought the second dam was going to bust under the pressure. Luckily it didn't, or we would have been flooded in the building with old people. Here's some decent pictures of the event.